All right, so based on our analysis, quite frankly, of the numbers and knowing what you do intimately, quite frankly, about each one of these cases, 20 over the last 2.5 years or so, what are your immediate observations about students who bring, in most cases, a loaded gun to school? Why are they doing that?
Well, I think first and foremost, it needs to be understood that one weapon is too many weapons for me as superintendent, as a parent, as an educator. So we take every one of these situations very seriously, and I think we have to continue to develop a culture where one is too many, and to create a zero tolerance when it comes to weapons in schools. I have been very adamant about trying to create a culture of progressive discipline and understanding why students make the decisions they make, conflict resolution, problem solving, so students don't make the same mistake twice. But I think when we're talking about weapons in schools, it's actually a completely different scenario because of what we know could be the horrific consequences of bringing a gun to school. But I would say it's important, I think, for viewers to understand that schools are not a reflection of the community, but oftentimes the community is a reflection of what happens in schools. And so, in other words, when we're talking about weapons being brought to school, it's often a product of what is or isn't happening in the home, or what is or isn't happening in the greater community. Time and time again, we have students bringing guns to schools, and we have no evidence at all that there was any intention of using the gun in school. So in other words, students are caught with weapons in schools, but after we interview the perpetrator, there's no evidence at all that the student had any intention of using the gun at school. Not even evidence that the student planned on using the gun after school. More times than not, it's an example of trying to perpetuate a culture of bravadoism or machoism, that it perpetuates this culture of a gun-carrying type of culture, that a student is hard or tough, or knows the right people, not to be threatened or intimidated, and or it's a situation where a student is participating in a almost I would call it a show and tell. Brings a gun to school to say, look at what I have, look at what I brought from my home. So again, it perpetuates this image of someone being tough and hard and someone that shouldn't be threatened or intimidated. But again, no examples of a gun being brought to school with the intent of using it during school hours or even when students are coming home from school. We do have some examples where students felt that they would be threatened on their way home to school or to school, and that's certainly concerning. But in no means is that justification for bringing a weapon to school. But even in those examples, there wasn't concrete evidence that a student planned on using the weapon against a particular person or a group of people that were threatening them. Just in general, they felt threatened or they felt that they would be bullied, and therefore having the gun would be a way to demonstrate that they were tough, that they shouldn't be threatened, and that they knew people that could help them in a situation. So in other words, to pull out the weapon to intimidate the people that were trying to do harm to that individual, but still no intent to use it. But with all that said, we all know that bringing a gun to school once, especially a loaded weapon or with bullets nearby, that gun could be used, even though the intent's not there. A fight breaks out, someone gets angry, the gun falls in the hands of the wrong person, and then we know what horrifically could happen to our students.
So do you think that this is, because what's interesting in my analysis that we found of the numbers, the majority of these are 16-year-old African-American boys. Is there something that as a school and as a superintendent that you can do to cater specifically to that age group in particular and encourage them to bring other things to school that are not dangerous, that can establish themselves as smart, athletic, and not gun-toting?
Yeah, I think it's important in any of these conversations not to cast a one-size-fits-all analysis or stereotype or characteristic of a group of students. And so unfortunately, as you said, we do have these incidents with a particular group of boys at times. But I think that when we talk about bringing weapons to school, we're talking about all students. We've even had situations where we've had females involved with weapons. So I think it's important to walk away from a profile or a stereotype and recognize that this is a problem with all of our students, African American, white, Hispanic, male and female. As I said, we've seen both genders mixed and involved in guns. I think what we're trying to do is be proactive. We're trying to create a culture of transparency where students where students own the culture that they're a part of. So what I think is positive about many of these stories, if you will, is that we are learning that these weapons are being brought to school by other students. So students are taking a level of ownership and responsibility in reporting that there's a weapon on campus to an officer, to a teacher, to an administrator, or to a parent. And then that's how we are detecting and finally find the weapon. So it's encouraging to know that students, all students, are saying enough is enough, and it's not about snitching, it's not about ratting on someone, it's about owning the culture that they want to have in their own school. And then coupled with that, we've enhanced our random searches. We do random searches on school buses. Before they get on buses, after they get off on buses, we randomly select classrooms to do searches in our secondary schools. If we get a tip, then we go to that particular classroom and search bags, lockers connected to those students if they have them. We've been doing a much better job, I think, of promoting through our automated call system and social media to check book bags, that parents need to check book bags randomly, talk to their kids about who they're hanging out with, talk to them about weapons in general. If they do have weapons at home, that they're secure in a secure, safe place, that they talk about when and how weapons should be used. So I think those are all things that we're doing differently, and that's specific to weapons and guns, knives. But I think to your other question, we certainly ramped up our mentoring programs. I mean, one that I'm most excited about is our 5,000 Role Models program, where now we have hundreds of students that are involved in the 5,000 Role Model program. We now have over 200 SROs, 200 JSO officers that were given to us by Sheriff Williams to participate in the 5,000 Role Models program. So those officers are connected to our young men, mainly African American boys and Hispanic boys, to serve as mentors. And so those individuals are going to Tallahassee to see how the legislative process works. They're visiting businesses, they're visiting government offices. And so that's just a small part of doing things differently and connecting our young boys to mentors. We have our Achievers for Life program, which is a middle school program for boys and girls, but it focuses on at-risk students. All of our middle schools now have what we call a life coach, which is a former social worker or psychologist that works with students that are considered at risk based on behavior, discipline, attendance, based on elementary when they move up to middle school. So every middle school now has this life coach that works with our at-risk students, boys and girls. We have deans of discipline now in every middle school and high school, and that position was created only to focus on discipline because our administrators wear a lot of hats. They're in classrooms looking at instruction, they're meeting with parents, they're recruiting, retaining teachers, and so the dean's sole focus is to implement the code of conduct, and that naturally allows them to build relationships with students, especially those students that are perpetually in trouble, so that they can build relationships with those individuals to create an environment where we're preventive and we're problem solving, not just reacting to the negative discipline. And in school culture, if you're able to build a relationship with your most at-risk students, oftentimes that can transform the entire environment because those are the students that often are the ones that are continually in problem.
How do you identify an at-risk student? What is that?
So if you're talking about students before they go into middle school, you're talking about attendance, you're talking about grades, you're talking about previous referrals at the elementary level. So there's a way to create an early warning system, which we've done that, to show what students are certainly on the wrong path. And that allows us to intervene in a preemptive way rather than in a reactionary way. And then the same applies to students as they go into high school. Also really excited about our City Year program. It's something that I think is a national trend of large urban school districts partnering with City Year. City Year recruits young people that are right out of high school or right out of college often from the same communities where they'll serve as Corps members. They work through AmeriCorps, and they serve all day long at the school. They're there very early when the students arrive. They're in the classrooms with students working in small groups and reading and math. They eat with the students at lunch. They offer after-school tutoring, and it's another opportunity to connect our students with young people that can relate to their challenges and issues, build those relationships so that there's a sense of trust. So all of our schools in the Ribault, Rains, Jackson feeder pattern at the high school and middle school level have City Year now. So that's another on-site consistent way to intervene and build relationships with students.
It's interesting that you mentioned those schools, because those are not the schools, according to our statistics, where guns are coming to school. In fact, I mean, you're talking about all over the city. Have you considered ever installing metal detectors as a preventative?
Yeah, it's a great question. This goes back to your earlier question about just African American students, and this is where this issue, I think, of the threat of bringing weapons to school is occurring throughout the county, especially on the west side, where I think you're seeing an increase in crime and gang activity. That's being stated clearly by the Sheriff's Office. Jack's Journey, for instance, the city's initiative to do more with after-school and summer programming. The shift is certainly on the west side. But to go back to your question, I'm often asked that about metal detectors, and I don't believe that metal detectors are the solution. We do have metal detectors at our alternative schools, where you have a stronger concentration of students that have been involved with more serious infractions. But having worked in New York City, for example, in the Bronx, where I was a teacher and a dean of discipline, where I was dealing constantly with gang-related issues, the metal detector was not a silver bullet. So even with a metal detector in a high school that had 4,000 students with the Bloods and the Crips, we still had weapons get into schools. And so it often,
guns?
Yeah, and often it is a false sense of protection when we're talking about metal detectors, especially when you consider today, and it's horrific to think about this, but if you Google ceramic weapons, you'll see that you can easily bring in lethal weapons into buildings that will never be detected from a metal detector. I also think metal detectors create a prison culture. It pained me to arrive to school early and seeing students in the cold in New York City waiting to get into a school, literally their line wrapped around the building. And so, again, although there was a sense of protection and safety with that, we still had weapons that got into school despite that. And the negative of going to a school that has the appearance and feeling of a prison is not right, especially when those metal detectors would be first implemented in schools in the urban core, where we're working with students that are predominantly minorities and low income. Again, we want our schools to be safe havens. We want our schools to be something different than what kids see and experience every day. The last thing that I want is the school to feel like a prison. And I think the movement to improve these conditions is really about more active communication with parents, parents taking ownership of what's happening with their students, a community rallying behind students, and we as a school district creating the right culture where students feel comfortable talking to us, not only about weapons, but even conflict. I mean, if some of these weapons are being brought to school as a result of bullying or threats, then we have to do a better job of creating a culture where students can come to us and say, I feel threatened, I'm scared. Can you help? And that's hard to do in a culture.
How do you do that? Because you're ratting me out and you're a tattletale.
I understand.
That brings me to Theo Pascal. I mean, an excellent example. He'd only been at the school for 4 months.
Right.
And he felt threatened, according to him and according to his father. Yeah. How do you help a student like that who feels that they have to bring a weapon to school just to protect themselves?
Well, I think that story starts with it's still unexcusable and unacceptable to bring a weapon to school. I mean, I think the conversation has to start there. But with that said, there has to be a willingness to come forth and talk to the administration and to talk to adults. And if the adults don't follow up and they don't take ownership of that, then shame on the adults and the employees, and then we'll follow through on disciplinary processes if that's the case. But you have to give us the opportunity to problem solve and to bring all the parties included to go through a mediation, to go through conflict resolution. But weapons are not the solution to the problem, and in no way does a real bad situation in any way become better by including a weapon as part of the solution. It just doesn't make sense on any level. I can still empathize and sympathize with any parent that feels that their child is being bullied and they're at wit's end of what to do. But in no way can we create any kind of dialogue or conversation that and somehow bringing a weapon to school is justifiable or right. And so there's got to be a level of responsibility on the part of the parent to actively, in a preemptive way, to talk to this school about what's happening. And I know it was mentioned, and my understanding is that the parent started to bring the child to school to avoid the bus. Well, if that was the case, then there was something that was understood and known that there was a threat involved. And that's when you have to get the school involved. And if the school can't handle it, then that's when we get police involved.
It's interesting because in looking at some of the numbers also, while 16 was the typical age, there were a lot of younger kids, 11, 13, 14, 3 15-year-olds. In fact, about a third of the statistics that we found, they're 16 years or younger. These are middle school and in some cases elementary school kids. Why bring a gun to school at that age?
Well, I think the only answer that I have to that is I think it's linked to this, the culture of violence, the culture of guns. And what I mean by the culture of guns, I know this always becomes a issue that is a polemic that divides people on, pro-gun, anti-gun. I'm not even getting involved in that. I mean, I do think that there's a space for citizens to own guns and to use them for hunting or even as a collector's item. I'm not getting involved in all of this, but what I am saying is that there certainly is a culture that our students are growing up in, whether it's through music, whether it's through videos, whether it's through commercials, whether it's through video games, whether it's through what they hear at home, what they see on the newspaper. I mean, how many times do you receive the newspaper and you see a sticker about a trade show for guns? Or how many students ride through their neighborhood? I know I do when I visit schools, and I see almost on every block there's a pawn shop. And students know that you can access guns that way. There are guns on the streets where, unfortunately, you don't know how many times I've met with students and I hear stories about students visiting a house. And one of the first things students do when they're bored is, oh, did you know that my dad, my mom, my uncle, my aunt has a gun? I've heard stories of this, and they'll go in the room and pull out the gun and they look at the gun as if it's a toy. I think somewhere inside them they know that this is a deadly weapon, but it's still part of a culture that they don't understand gun safety. And we've tried to even promote that with our officers, where our officers visit elementary schools and talk about gun safety and where there is space for guns, but if used the right way, and that you have to protect them and respect the use of guns and stay away from guns if an adult's not in a room, and tell an adult when you see a gun. We actually do that in our elementary schools to build that capacity and that awareness, and we've expanded that over the past couple of years to do that. But when you hear stories like this, you can see how the lack of an awareness can lead to a horrific and tragic ending. And we've actually, since I've been superintendent, we even had a child that was killed in a situation that I just explained, and I've heard other scenarios like this. So I'm trying to give you context to your question, which is certain children are growing up in homes where that fear of guns is not there, and the lack of respect for guns or not understanding the deadly nature of guns is negated because of what students are seeing on video games and culture in general. So when you have a student at a high school that takes a gun and takes a snapshot of, and puts it on social media, what does that tell you? It tells you that they're just mimicking and modeling what they see through whatever culture that they're identifying with, and that's usually related to either music or video games, and so they're just participating in the culture that they see, and that's not. There's a reality to that as well. If students are growing up in an environment You know, I think we often don't see the other side. As superintendent, as a teacher in the urban core, I have seen how students are exposed to things that the other side of the world never understands or sees. So when students talk about seeing guns, that's part of their culture. That's part of their existence. As horrific as that is, that's a reality. Many of our students are seeing it when they're walking with their friends throughout the neighborhood, when they, like I said, they visit homes. And so that only leads to that coming into schools. And so that's why we see what we see, and that's why I often say our schools are a reflection of what's happening in the community. Our schools do not set the culture tone for the community. That comes into our schools, and then we do everything we can to negate that and overcome that so students are focused on their education. But that is a constant struggle and a challenge, but one that we embrace, and that's part of the work, but it is a reality that we deal with.
How do you combat then the social media aspect of this? Because you have threats on social media, and a couple of these mentioned Snapchat photos as an example, threatening, and then also just the bullying part of it, and then also the spreading this message of, look, this is cool, I'm posing with a gun in a photo. How do you, as a superintendent who's in charge of educating the kids, how do you fight something like that to try to just keep the kids' attention so they're not bringing the guns to school?
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about before. It's about building awareness, especially with students at young ages at the elementary level. But it's also trying to create a culture in schools where you are constantly trying to emphasize positive and high expectations for students, regardless of what they're seeing and facing. For those students that don't always have the consistent role models, trying to insert those role models more consistently in their lives. And then as far as school culture is concerned, is continuing to reinforce what kind of culture we want in our schools. Regardless of what's going on outside, is our schools need to be not only safe havens, but places where students can forget about the other stuff and focus on their education. And I think all in all, we do a fairly strong job of that. I think we can get better. I think everyone has to own that, and it has to be constantly reinforced to where when you're in school, when that door closes or when you're picked up on the bus, we now start a new world. We start a new process, and we respect what are the challenges of the outside community, but we don't use that as an excuse. And we try to create an environment where students can reach their academic and civic potential, and we're messaging the right things to our students so that they can grow in an environment where they believe in themselves and they can walk away from the negativity that they often are exposed to at home and in the greater community.
So what do you say to the parent who's a huge proponent in this? I mean, at the end of the day, as you said, it's a product of your culture.
Yeah.
How important is the parent component in this, and what do you say to the parent who will be watching this and looking at these statistics?
Well, I think it's essential that you develop a strong, honest, consistent relationship with your child. And what I mean by that is you are the adult. And I see, unfortunately, time and time again, that adults want to be their children's friend. You don't need to be your child's friend until that child is grown. Then you can turn into a friend. And even at that, I hesitate with that because I think of my own children. I don't know even later on in life if it's strictly going to be a friend. But I say, you know, I have 3 boys, and in fact, Rachel and I were talking about this morning. Is I grew up in a home without a father. And I see now my oldest, and I hate to use my kids as an example because they hate it when I do, but I see my oldest son, who's a beautiful, intelligent boy, young boy, teenager now, and I see him challenge. I see him challenge those boundaries because it's part of growing up, and especially it's part of growing up and being a man. And I see how he will push back on Rachel. And when I get involved, it's a different scenario. I honestly see how he's gravitating more towards me. So he loves alone time. So if I'm getting in the car to run an errand, he'll say, I'll go with you, Papa. And he'll get in the car and just run to CVS or run to the grocery store. And a part of me says, why are you coming? You know, I don't say it out loud, but it's because he wants to be around that older male. It's natural. I mean, it's part of growing up. And luckily, my grandfather got involved in my life, and I had some great coaches that filled the gap. But I even said to Rachel this morning, I said, now you see what I went through as, I said, do you see now why it's so important for young men to have positive male adult role models in their life? And she said, I always knew that, but I see it even more now with our sons, especially our oldest. And I see, do you see why it was so challenging for me when I grew up and why I made mistakes when I was growing up? And she said, absolutely. She said it would be very difficult to raise him and the other boys on my own. She could do it because she's a very strong woman, and many women have done it. My own mother did it. But it's not the ideal scenario, and we see boys growing up with that vacuum. And so that's why the 5,000 role models is so important. Achievers for Life, City Year, trying to recruit more male teachers, especially African American male teachers, because our students need, our males need to see what they can become. And they also, it is a different conversation often between a teenage boy and an adult female versus an adult male. There are certain things that are different. Those relationships are also important because you want children to grow up with that androgynous experience, because I think it shapes you both ways. But that male role model component is important. So when I see what's happening with a lot of our youth, I can relate to what I went through, but I can also understand how I ended up moving in the right direction. And that's why we have to work so hard to build those support systems for our students, because it only takes one bad decision to ruin a child's life and other children's life, and we know that.